In 2023, the blockchain industry was valued at $2.3 trillion. Companies like IBM, Maersk, and Walmart announced revolutionary projects that would transform supply chains, banking, and global trade forever. But when independent researchers finally studied what happened to these implementations, they discovered something the industry desperately tried to hide. 92% of enterprise blockchain projects launched between 2017 and 2022 are now dead, abandoned, or exist only as marketing copy on archived web pages. But the real number is even worse than 92%. When investigators dug into the actual data, they found that of the remaining 8% still running, nearly half produce no measurable business value and cost more to maintain than the systems they replaced. We're talking about billions in shareholder money, thousands of engineering hours, and entire departments built around technology that fundamentally failed to deliver on a single core promise. This isn't a story about technology failing to mature. This is a story about the biggest corporate con of the 21st century, where Fortune 500 executives knowingly misled investors, employees, and the public about implementations that were failing in real time. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand exactly why 3 major CEOs quietly scrubbed all the mention of blockchain from their annual reports in the same quarter, why consulting firms that made hundreds of millions selling blockchain transformations now refuse to discuss those clients, and how an entire industry burned through more capital than the dot-com bubble while producing less than 5% of the promised outcomes. My name is David Chen, and this is Vault Report. Here's what we're going to cover: how MIT researchers uncovered the 92% failure rate, the shadow operation that let companies fake success for years, and the $4.7 billion consulting scheme that made failure inevitable. Stay until the end, because what happened when researchers tried to get executives to talk reveals the real scandal. Here's the question nobody in Silicon Valley wanted to answer: how can blockchain be disrupting every industry on Earth, but also be costing corporations billions of dollars with almost nothing to show for it? The math simply doesn't work. You can't simultaneously be the future of business infrastructure while having a failure rate that exceeds any technology adoption in modern corporate history. Yet, for nearly 6 years, that's exactly the story the industry sold, and it worked. Venture capital poured $30 billion into blockchain startups between 2017 and 2023. IBM assigned over 1,000 engineers to blockchain projects. Consulting firms like Deloitte and Accenture built entire practice groups around it. Universities launched blockchain research centers funded by corporate sponsors. Every major tech conference had blockchain tracks. Every serious business publication ran features on executives who were blockchain pioneers. And then, something happened. Or more accurately, nothing happened. The projects didn't scale. The cost savings never materialized. The revolutionary transparency turned into a compliance nightmare. The immutable records became a liability when errors needed correction. The decentralization that was supposed to eliminate intermediaries just created new, more expensive intermediaries. And slowly, quietly, without press releases or explanations, companies started shutting it all down. But here's what makes this story different from typical tech failures. This wasn't a case of promising technology that simply needed more time. This was a case of fundamental architectural problems that were known from day one, ignored by executives who had already committed to the narrative, and actively concealed from boards and shareholders until the money ran out. The people who built these systems knew they wouldn't work at enterprise scale. They knew the performance problems were unsolvable with current architecture. They knew that distributed ledgers made terrible databases for almost every real business use case. And they built them anyway, because the incentives were too powerful to resist. If you were a VP of innovation in 2018 and you weren't doing something with blockchain, you looked like you were asleep at the wheel. If you were a consulting partner and you weren't selling blockchain transformations, you were leaving money on the table. If you were a startup founder and you didn't put blockchain in your pitch deck, you weren't getting funded. So everyone played along. And the result was the largest coordinated waste of corporate resources since the re-engineering fad of the 1990s, except this time with blockchain. The technology itself was so poorly understood that nobody even knew how to measure whether it was working, which meant projects could fail in slow motion for years before anyone with authority understood what was happening. The story of how researchers finally measured this failure starts in 2023, when a team at MIT's Digital Economy Initiative realized something obvious. Despite hundreds of proclaimed blockchain implementations, nobody had systematically studied what happened to them. There were no follow-up investigations, no independent audits, no academic papers tracking outcomes. The consulting firms that built the systems weren't publishing case studies anymore. The executives who championed the projects had moved to other companies. The press releases announced launches but never covered shutdowns. It was a perfect information vacuum. So the researchers did something simple. They compiled every major blockchain announcement from 2017 to 2022. Over 380 projects from Fortune 1000 companies representing more than $14 billion in disclosed investment. Then they systematically investigated what happened. They filed information requests. They interviewed former project members under confidentiality agreements. They analyzed GitHub repositories to see if code was still being maintained. They checked patent filings, conference presentations, employee LinkedIn updates, anything that would indicate whether these projects still existed. What they found was staggering. Of 380 announced projects, 351 were confirmed, dead, abandoned, or transitioned to non-blockchain solutions. That's 92.4%. Of the remaining 29 projects still running, 14 showed no evidence of material business impact. They were running in pilot mode, processing tiny transaction volumes, or operating as proof of concepts with no path to production scale. That left 15 projects, less than 4% of the total, that could be classified as operational implementations handling real business volume. But even among these survivors, the outcomes were damning. None achieved the cost reductions promised in original business cases. None processed transaction volumes anywhere close to projections. None eliminated the intermediaries they were supposed to replace. In fact, most required more intermediaries: blockchain consultants, node operators, smart contract auditors, than the systems they replaced. The median project spent 3.7 times its original budget and took 2.4 times longer than planned before being abandoned. And perhaps most tellingly, when researchers asked former project leaders whether they would do it again, 87% said no. But the research team didn't stop there. They wanted to understand not just that the projects failed, but how they failed. What were the actual breaking points? Where did the promises meet reality? But knowing what failed is only half the story. Because the real question is why these projects kept running for years when everyone inside knew they weren't working. The answer reveals a deception that went all the way to the boardroom. At the 18-month mark, something strange started happening at every single one of these companies. Stay with me, because this pattern reveals the entire con. In nearly every case, the project had launched with enormous fanfare, executive blog posts, partnership announcements, tech conference demos, press coverage in business media. And for the first 12 to 18 months, everything looked successful from the outside. The companies would report that the blockchain was operational, processing transactions, delivering transparency and security. But inside the organization, a different story was unfolding. The operations teams responsible for actually using the system were quietly reverting to the old processes. Why? Because the blockchain implementation was slower, more complex, more expensive, and less reliable than what it replaced. But nobody wanted to be the person who killed the blockchain project. It had executive sponsorship. It had been announced publicly. Consultants were being paid millions to support it. Engineering teams had spent years building it. So instead of shutting it down, they ran it in parallel with the legacy system. The legacy system handled the real work. The blockchain handled a tiny subset of transactions sufficient to claim it was operational. This shadow operation could continue for years, as long as the executive sponsor remained at the company and the project had budget. Nobody had incentive to expose it. The executives could point to the blockchain in presentations. The consultants could use it as a case study. The engineers could put it on their resumes. Everyone benefited from the fiction except the shareholders funding it. What finally killed most projects wasn't technical failure or executive decision. It was executive departure. When the VP or Chief Innovation Officer who championed the blockchain moved to another company, the protection disappeared. New leadership would ask basic questions. What business value is this delivering? How much are we spending? Why is the operations team still using the old system? And within 6 months of that leadership change, the project would be quietly shut down. No announcement, no explanation. Just a redirection of budget and a disbanded team. The researchers documented this pattern in over 60% of the failed projects. The median time from executive sponsor departure to project termination was 7 months. Now you might be wondering, how did companies spend billions on these projects without anyone noticing they weren't working? That question leads us into the darkest part of this story. The incentive structures that made blockchain failure not just possible, but inevitable. The consulting firms are where this begins. Between 2017 and 2022, the Big Four consulting firms, Deloitte, PwC, KPMG, and EY, plus technology consultants like Accenture and IBM services, generated an estimated $4.7 billion in blockchain-related revenue. These firms had every incentive to sell blockchain projects and no incentive to make them succeed long-term. Here's why. The typical blockchain engagement worked like this. A consulting firm would approach a corporation with a blockchain opportunity assessment. This initial engagement might cost $200,000 to $500,000 and would inevitably conclude that, yes, blockchain could transform multiple parts of your business. Phase 2 was the pilot. This would cost $2 to $5 million and involve building a proof of concept, usually involving a handful of transactions and a controlled test environment. The consultants would carefully design the test to avoid the performance and scalability problems inherent in blockchain architecture. They would demonstrate that, yes, you can put transaction records on a distributed ledger. Then came Phase 3, the enterprise implementation. This is where the real money was made. Implementations typically cost $15 to $40 million and could extend for 2 to 3 years. They required integrating the blockchain with legacy systems, training staff, establishing governance, managing node operations, everything. And here's the key. The consulting firms got paid for the work, not the results. They got paid to build the system, not to make it perform better than what it replaced. They got paid for workshops and change management and documentation, regardless of whether the system ever processed meaningful transaction volume. And they got paid handsomely. Former consultants interviewed for the study reported billing rates of $400 to $800 per hour for blockchain specialists, 2 to 3 times the rate for equivalent enterprise software work. Why the premium? Scarcity. There were very few people who understood both blockchain technology and enterprise architecture, so consulting firms could charge whatever they wanted. They would hire developers with cryptocurrency experience at $200,000 to $300,000 salaries, bill them out at $600 per hour, and generate 80% margins on the labor. It was extraordinarily profitable work, and as long as the client kept funding it, there was no incentive to raise the fundamental question of whether blockchain was the right solution at all. But the consultants weren't the only ones with perverse incentives. The executives who championed these projects had their own reasons to ignore failure signals. In the innovation economy of the late 2010s, executives were judged on their vision and their willingness to embrace disruption. Blockchain became the ultimate signal of forward-thinking leadership. A chief innovation officer who launched a blockchain initiative would be invited to speak at conferences. They'd be featured in Harvard Business Review case studies. They'd be recruited by other companies looking for transformational leaders. The project itself almost didn't matter. What mattered was being associated with the future. And once an executive had publicly committed to blockchain, admitting failure carried enormous reputational cost. You'd be admitting you wasted millions of dollars on technology you didn't understand. You'd be admitting you fell for hype. You'd be admitting you made a bad bet. Far easier to keep the project alive, keep reporting that it's delivering value, and hope that either blockchain actually breaks through, or you move to a new role before anyone asks hard questions. The researchers found that executives who championed failed blockchain projects stayed at their companies an average of 19 months after project launch. By the time the projects were shut down, those executives were gone. They'd moved on to bigger roles at other companies, often touting their blockchain experience in the process. The cost was borne by the shareholders. The career benefit accrued to the executives. And this dynamic, this separation of benefit and cost, is what allowed the blockchain bubble to inflate far beyond any reasonable technical justification. What happened next would expose the biggest cover-up in corporate tech adoption history. But first, we need to understand who knew this was coming, because there were people warning about this. Computer scientists who understood distributed systems, database engineers who knew the performance limitations, security researchers who identified the fundamental trade-offs. They were publishing papers, giving talks, explaining exactly why blockchain wouldn't work for most enterprise use cases, but they were ignored. Why? Because they were telling executives something executives didn't want to hear. They were saying, blockchain is an interesting technology for a narrow set of use cases where you need decentralized consensus among parties who don't trust each other. For everything else, it's a slower, more expensive, more complex way to do what databases already do well. That nuanced message couldn't compete with the consultants and vendors and conference keynotes promising transformation. The skeptics were positioned as people who didn't get it, people who were stuck in old paradigms, people who were afraid of disruption. And so they were marginalized while the believers, many of whom had financial incentives to believe, shaped the narrative. But the skeptics were right, and by 2021 the evidence was overwhelming. The question is, when did the companies know? When did the executives and board members and investors realize that their blockchain projects weren't going to deliver? The answer appears to be late 2021 to early 2022. That's when you start seeing subtle changes in corporate communication. Annual reports that mention blockchain prominently in 2020 either drop it entirely or move it to a brief mention in the innovation section by 2022. Executives who gave blockchain keynotes in 2019 and 2020 stop accepting those invitations by 2022. Companies that issued blockchain-related press releases every quarter suddenly go silent. What happened? The researchers identified 3 catalysts, but knowing when companies realized blockchain was failing is only part of the story. What they did with that knowledge and who they told reveals just how deep the deception went. Because while executives were quietly retreating, shareholders were still being told that transformation was underway. The cryptocurrency crash of 2022 was the first catalyst, when Bitcoin and Ethereum lost 70% of their value and multiple crypto firms collapsed. Blockchain lost its association with financial success. It was no longer the technology of the future. It was the technology of a bubble that popped. The second catalyst was the first wave of honest postmortems. Former project leaders, no longer bound by corporate PR, began writing blog posts and giving talks about why their blockchain implementations failed. These weren't theoretical criticisms. These were detailed, specific accounts of projects collapsing under their own complexity. The third catalyst was activist investors starting to ask questions. As technology budgets came under scrutiny in the 2022 economic downturn, investors demanded evidence that innovation spending was delivering returns. Blockchain projects couldn't provide that evidence. They had consumed enormous resources and delivered virtually nothing of measurable value, and so they became targets for cost-cutting. Between Q4 2021 and Q4 2023, the researchers estimate that over 200 enterprise blockchain projects were terminated. Some were shut down explicitly. Others were quietly defunded until they collapsed. A few were transitioned into conventional database systems with the blockchain components stripped out. The latter category is particularly interesting. Several companies discovered that once you removed the blockchain layer from their architecture, performance improved dramatically, complexity decreased, and the systems actually became useful. This raised an uncomfortable question. If the system works better without the blockchain, why was the blockchain there in the first place? The answer, of course, is that it wasn't there for technical reasons. It was there for narrative reasons. It was there because in 2018, companies needed to say they were doing blockchain. The technology was cargo cult innovation. Innovation because it looked like innovation, not because it solved problems. And that's what makes this story a scandal, rather than just a failure. Technologies fail all the time. That's normal and expected. What's not normal is an entire industry building and funding technology they know doesn't work, for reasons that have nothing to do with the technology's merits. What's not normal is consultants selling solutions they know will fail. What's not normal is executives championing projects they don't understand to advance their careers while shareholders bear the cost. By the end of 2023, 3 Fortune 500 CEOs had quietly scrubbed all the mention of blockchain from their annual reports in the same quarter. These weren't minor players. These were companies that had been held up as blockchain leaders, companies whose implementations were showcased at conferences, companies whose executives had told investors that blockchain was core to their digital strategy. And then, with no explanation, it all disappeared from official communication. The researchers attempted to interview executives from these companies. All declined. They attempted to get comment from the consulting firms that had built the implementations. All declined, or provided vague statements about client confidentiality. They reached out to the industry trade groups that had promoted enterprise blockchain adoption. Those organizations had quietly shut down or pivoted to other technologies. The silence was universal and coordinated. Nobody wanted to talk about what happened. Nobody wanted to acknowledge the waste. Nobody wanted to take responsibility. And without accountability, there's no learning. There's no institutional memory of why this failed, which means when the next overhyped technology comes along, and it will, the same dynamics will play out again. Different technology, same incentives, same results. Now the few projects that actually survived tell a different story. The 4% that are still running. What made them different? The researchers identified 3 common characteristics. The projects had clear, specific use cases where blockchain's unique properties actually mattered. Usually, this involved multiple organizations that needed to share data but didn't trust each other enough to let any single party control the database. This is legitimately what blockchain is good for. The projects were also scoped narrowly. They weren't trying to revolutionize entire business models. They were solving specific data-sharing problems. The transaction volumes were modest. The integration requirements were manageable. The expectations were realistic. And the projects had technical leadership who actually understood distributed systems, not just blockchain evangelists. They knew the limitations. They designed around the performance problems. They built the systems to do what blockchain can do, not what the marketing said it should do. These successful projects share another characteristic. None of them generated the transformational returns that were promised in the blockchain hype cycle. They're useful systems. They solve real problems, but they deliver incremental value, not revolutionary value. They're not changing industries. They're not eliminating intermediaries. They're not creating new business models. They're just a different way to manage certain types of shared data. And that's fine. That's useful, but it's not what was sold. And it doesn't justify the hundreds of billions of dollars invested in blockchain over the past 7 years. So what did that money actually buy? In most cases, very expensive learning. Companies learned that blockchain doesn't solve most of the problems they thought it would solve. They learned that the real barriers to business transformation aren't technological, they're organizational and regulatory. They learned that distributed ledgers are terrible general-purpose databases. They learned that immutability sounds great until you need to correct an error or comply with data deletion laws. These are valuable lessons, but they're lessons that computer scientists had been trying to teach for free. The companies paid billions to learn through experience what they could have learned by listening to experts. Now, I want to address the obvious question. Is this just a story about blockchain, or is it a pattern that repeats with other technologies? Because right now, in 2025, we're watching a similar dynamic play out with artificial intelligence. The parallels are striking. Companies are announcing AI transformations. Consultants are selling AI implementations. Executives are positioning themselves as AI visionaries. Billions of dollars are being invested. And beneath the surface, there are warning signs that much of this is following the blockchain playbook. Not all of it. AI is genuinely useful for specific applications, but the hype, the incentives, the lack of honest assessment, it all feels familiar. A PwC survey in late 2024 found that 67% of CEOs have invested in AI, but only 23% report seeing measurable returns. Those numbers should sound familiar. They're almost identical to blockchain survey results from 2020. And just like with blockchain, the response isn't to reassess the investment thesis. The response is to invest more, to push harder, to insist that the transformation is still coming. At some point, somebody has to ask the uncomfortable question: how much of corporate innovation spending is actually innovation, and how much is theater? How much is executives doing what they think innovation looks like, rather than what actually creates value? The blockchain story suggests the answer is a lot. The researchers estimate that of the $4 billion they tracked in disclosed blockchain investment, less than $400 million went to the 15 projects that could be classified as successful. That's less than 3% efficiency. 97% of the money was wasted on projects that either failed outright or delivered no measurable value. In any other context, that would trigger congressional hearings, shareholder lawsuits, executive terminations. In the innovation economy, it triggered nothing. The executives moved on. The consultants found new projects. The companies wrote it off as the cost of staying competitive. And the shareholders, the people who actually paid for all of this, never got an explanation. Now the human cost matters too, because it wasn't just money that was wasted. Thousands of engineers spent years of their careers building systems that were doomed from the start. Talented developers who could have been solving real problems were instead fighting the fundamental limitations of blockchain architecture, trying to make it do things it was never designed to do. Many of them knew the projects would fail. They raised concerns, they documented the performance problems, they explained the architectural impossibilities, and they were told to make it work anyway. Because the company had announced it, because the executive had committed, because the consultant had promised. These engineers were put in an impossible position. They couldn't make the technology do what was promised, but they also couldn't say that publicly without ending their careers. So they did their best, knowing it wouldn't be good enough, and watched as years of work was eventually abandoned. The psychological toll of that, building something you know is doomed, is significant. It's one of the reasons blockchain engineers from this era are so cynical about corporate innovation. Several of the engineers interviewed for the study described the experience as a turning point in their careers. The moment they realized that corporate technology decisions are often made for reasons that have nothing to do with whether the technology works. After blockchain, they said, they couldn't take innovation announcements seriously anymore. They'd seen behind the curtain. They knew how the game was played. And that cynicism, that loss of trust in corporate leadership, is a cost that doesn't show up in any budget. But it's real and it's corrosive. It makes the next transformation harder because the people who have to build it don't believe in it anymore. So where does this leave us? What are the lessons from the great blockchain failure? What this story actually teaches you starts with something obvious. Technologies should be evaluated on their actual capabilities, not their narrative appeal. Blockchain became a solution looking for problems because the story of blockchain was compelling even when the technology wasn't. Companies need to separate the hype from the reality and make decisions based on evidence, not fear of missing out. Incentive structures matter just as much. When the people selling and championing technologies profit regardless of outcomes, you get outcomes like this. There needs to be accountability for results, not just activity. Consultants should have skin in the game. Executives should be judged on value delivered, not initiatives launched. And expert skepticism should be valued, not dismissed. The people warning about blockchain's limitations were right. They should have been listened to. But corporate culture too often treats skepticism as negativity and confuses criticism with resistance to change. Organizations need to create space for critical voices, especially when those voices have technical expertise. Pilot projects need clear success criteria and honest evaluation. Most blockchain pilots were designed to succeed in controlled conditions that had nothing to do with real-world requirements. Companies ran pilots that processed 50 transactions per day and then tried to scale to systems that needed 50,000 transactions per day. The pilots proved nothing, except that a technology works when you carefully avoid its limitations. Real pilots should test the hardest problems, not the easiest ones. And failure should be acknowledged and learned from. The silence around blockchain's collapse means the lessons aren't being captured. Companies are moving on without documenting what went wrong or why, which means institutional memory is lost. The next wave of leaders won't know this history, and they'll make the same mistakes. There should be post-mortems, there should be case studies, there should be honest discussion of what happened and why. Not to shame anyone, but to learn, because this will happen again. There will be another technology that captures imagination and attracts hype and draws investment beyond its actual capabilities. The question is whether we'll handle it differently next time. Right now, the evidence suggests we won't. Because the same dynamics that drove the blockchain bubble are still in place, the same incentives, the same career pressures, the same consulting business models. Nothing structural has changed, which means we're likely to see this pattern repeat. In fact, we might already be seeing it. Look at the metaverse. Billions invested, very little to show for it, and now a quiet retreat by the companies that championed it. Look at Web3, which was supposed to decentralize the internet and instead produced mostly speculation and fraud. Look at various AI applications that promise transformation but deliver tools. The pattern repeats because the underlying cause, the disconnect between innovation theater and actual innovation, hasn't been addressed. One final detail from the research is particularly damning. The researchers tried to find even one blockchain executive who would speak on the record about their project's failure and what they learned. They contacted 47 former executives from failed projects. They offered anonymity. They offered the chance to shape the narrative and extract lessons. 46 declined. One agreed to talk and then backed out. The silence is total. Nobody wants to be associated with failure, even to help others avoid it. That tells you everything about the incentive structure. It's better to pretend it never happened than to acknowledge the waste and try to learn from it. And so, billions of dollars vanished, thousands of person-years of effort were squandered, and shareholders funded an experiment that people running it knew wouldn't work. And there's no accountability, no consequences, and no institutional learning. That's the real scandal. Not that blockchain failed, technologies fail, but that an entire industry built around something that couldn't work at scale, knew it couldn't work, kept selling it anyway, and faced no reckoning when it collapsed. The executives moved on to better jobs. The consultants moved on to the next hype cycle. The engineers moved on to new projects. The shareholders were left holding the bag, and the cycle continues. So when you hear the next transformation promise, when you see the press releases and the conference keynotes and the innovation announcements, remember the blockchain failure rate. 92% dead, 4% surviving but not thriving, and billions of dollars spent to learn what experts tried to teach for free. Ask the uncomfortable questions. Who benefits from this investment? What evidence supports the claims? What would failure look like? And how would we know? Who's accountable for results? Those questions won't make you popular. They'll make you sound like a skeptic, like someone who doesn't get it, like someone stuck in the old paradigm. But asking those questions might save your company from becoming the next case study in how innovation theater destroys shareholder value. The blockchain collapse is a warning. Watch corporate AI announcements over the next 18 months. Count how many quietly disappear from annual reports. Every silent retreat will either prove this pattern wrong or confirm that the next trillion-dollar reckoning is already underway. This is Vault Report. Thanks for listening.